Tübingen's Lucas Prize for Holocaust Studies, and he's won 2 National Jewish Book Awards, and he continues his scholarly pace at an exceptionally high level. He's received honorary doctorates from Graz College and the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. He's received a Distinguished Achievement Award for Holocaust Studies and Research by the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University. And I can personally attest that anybody in the field of Holocaust studies owes Professor Stephen Katz a great, great, great deal. Today, Stephen will be lecturing on the topic, Jewish resistance during the Holocaust.
Thank you, Alan. That was the kind of introduction my mother would have believed, my father would have appreciated.
Good.
Today, I thank Professor Berger and his staff who have been extremely kind and made this a very simple activity to sign on and get involved. So I thank everybody in Boca. Also to those of you who's come in to listen to the lecture. Today, I want to talk about Jewish resistance, but I want to do it from a somewhat different angle. I know that everybody in an audience like this has probably discussed the subject, knows the traditional charge against the Jewish people that they went like lambs to the slaughter. But the fact of the matter is the issue is altogether more complicated, needs to be examined from many, many points of view. And today what I'd like to do, instead of giving you just information about resistance here, resistance there, in the sense of telling you about the Warsaw Ghetto, Nachamo, once again, or telling you about the Auschwitz uprising once again, I want to provide you with a broader conspectus on how to think about the subject of Jewish resistance and all of the pieces that you need to bring into the puzzle. First of all, I want to say that Jews were not passive. Jews were not waiting to be slaughtered right from the beginning, which means German Jewry in the 1930s. German Jews got the message. There were about 500,000 German Jews, and they understood the threat posed by Hitler, even though the threat of the final solution did not exist. And so they made their way wherever they could find a place. And between them and the Austrians, who numbered another 175 to 200,000, of about 700,000 Jews, about 480 to 500,000 managed to run away. Of course, many of them were captured eventually in Brussels or in Amsterdam or in Paris, but it's not because they weren't active. They weren't very much concerned to do something that would resist the threat they posed. Also, if there were time, I would tell you about the remarkable cultural life that they created. Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher in the educational sphere, took over Jewish education in Germany. The Reichsvertretung, the Jewish organization for German Jews, put him in charge. He worked up an enormous program. He brought people back to the synagogue. He taught people Hebrew. Remember, German Jewry was extremely, extremely assimilated. There were Jews, very large number of which had never been in a synagogue. So all of this is really an honorable thing to say, a remarkable thing to say about German Jewry. By 1939, 84% of young Jews under the age of 25 had left Germany, 84%. Now, I mentioned that because we're going to come back to it again later. Age has a lot to do with resistance. It's one thing for my students to run away. It's another thing for me to run away. So age is important in this story. The resistance is often younger people, and it begins in Germany, where 84% of the young people run away. But it was not only German Jews who got the message. We know 300,000 Polish Jews fled from Poland. Remember, they went with the Russian army that had previously controlled the eastern part of Poland. They went into the Soviet Union. Many went as far as Siberia. 300,000 people found themselves under Stalin, but most saved their lives if they could avoid the Einsatzgruppe. 40,000 came to America. It is, of course, the great shame of the United States that they only let in 40,000. They purposely closed the borders, made it very, very, very difficult to get a visa. The man in charge of the process, Breckinridge Long, was an anti-Semitic Southerner. He sent a telegram to all the US embassies and consulates in Europe and said, delay, delay, delay. Meaning if you got an application from a Jew, do all kinds of things to defraud them from the opportunity. 40,000 French Jews managed to go to Switzerland and Spain. 1,600 Dutch Jews managed to go to England. So you see that already in the 1930s, Jews were active against all the claims that they just waited to be murdered. The second issue I want to raise with you, just in a preliminary way for you to think about it, is how do you measure resistance? Does it mean that you have the intent to resist? Does that count? Or do you only measure success, outcomes? But that gets complicated. For example, in Riga, famous city in Latvia, there was an underground and they had planned resistance, but they were betrayed by someone and so they were all murdered. But does that mean there was no resistance in Latvia? There was the same in Vilna and Bialystok. There were resistance movements. There was plans for uprising, stolen, all these places, but they couldn't do it because they were betrayed. Also, you have to remember when you think about Jews that you have to think about things comparatively. That is to say, if you think about cases of mass murder, of mass slaughter, crimes against humanity, it's always outsiders who end the violence. It's not the insiders. By that I mean, it took the British and Americans in World War I to end the killing of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. It took the outside forces from neighboring countries to end the slaughter in Rwanda. It took the international community. Elie Wiesel finally woke up Bill Clinton to interfere, and they interfered in Srebrenica in the Yugoslavian civil war. They put an end to it, but it wasn't the people in Srebrenica who did it. And Pol Pot, the great, violent, horrific, fiendish communist in Cambodia, was overthrown only when the Vietnamese army entered Cambodia. Therefore, I want to say you should think about resistance in very broad terms. You need to think about it in more than whether you actually succeeded. In addition, we have to ask ourselves, when we think about it, do we count the number of Germans killed? Is that the criteria? The percentage of resistors who were killed, Jews who were killed? The number of Jews who were saved? One of your audience had a mother who was saved by the Bielski brothers. And Bielski himself, Tulya Bielski, once said, if I had the opportunity to kill a German or save a Jew, I would save the Jew. So resistance comes in many forms. Also, you have to ask yourself, what's the long-term implications of what was done? Not only the military, but the non-military consequences of an action. Also, there's a whole world we're going to return to in a few minutes, where I'm going to tell you that resistance has to be defined broadly and in two ways. One is the normal way we think about resistance, the French underground, the Dutch underground, the Polish underground, the Norwegian underground. That means taking a gun, blowing up trains, destroying munition dumps, killing SS men. But then there's another form of resistance unique to the Jews, and I say unique to the Jews, which we call spiritual resistance. In Hebrew, it's called amudah, position. And we'll come back to talk about that. But when you talk about resistance, you have to know a lot about this spiritual resistance to understand what the Jews were all about, what they were doing. In addition, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to understand this question, you have to look at a map of Europe and Nazi policy. By that, I mean every place, we talk about the Shoah, the Holocaust, as if it were a monolith. From one end of Europe to the other end of Europe, it was the same. Now, it's true that from the center in Berlin, that's very much what Hitler wanted. He wanted Europe and the world really to be Judenfrei, to be free of Jews. But in fact, when you look at the way the policy was instituted across Europe, you find there's a very, very important thing that affects this issue of resistance. How much power did the Nazis allow to local governments? That is to say, what was the degree of Nazi control? So, for example, in Poland, 3,300,000 Jews, 300,000 ran away. There was no government of Poles. It was run from Krakow by the German army, and they held a very tight sway. They murdered anyone who helped a Jew. Very strict control. On the other hand, in Holland, there was much less control because they thought the Dutch were Aryans. They thought the Dutch were a beautiful people who looked like them, and therefore they could be given more space. There, the killers turned out to be in some way Dutchmen. On the other hand, in Denmark, they give a lot of space because the Danes are very beautiful. They're all blonde and tall. And so they had very little outside control. They managed to save 7,200 out of 8,000 Jews in Denmark by getting all the Jews to come to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah in 1943. It's a lesson. You should go to the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah because the 800 who didn't come to shul were caught. The other 7,200 were given passage to Sweden. So the fact is, you have to look when you discuss this issue, what's possible? How much space was there for resistance? To get a weapon, to travel around, to communicate with others, to try to build some sort of coalition with non-Jewish underground groups and the like. Also, you have to take into account a subject you probably never thought about when you talked about resistance, and that's geography. Geography is very, very important. And it's important for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, that once the ghettos were established, right? Ghettos start to be established in the spring of 1940. And they continue till the dissolution, the closing of the Lodz Ghetto in August 44. Now, the question of the ghettos is an intermediate step. Jews go from being free citizens to being ghetto dwellers and then on to death camps. The fact is that in the ghettos, you have to look at where they are. For example, in Minsk and Kovna, they were near forests. So Jews were able to escape from the ghettos and find refuge in the forests. If you go to Vilna or you go to Warsaw, you'll see there's no place to run. In Warsaw, the place they ran was to the sewer underground. So flight was a matter of what was possible. In Belorussia or the Western Ukraine, you had forests, you had places that could give you coverage. We know, for example, of Volhynia, 3,000 Jews saved themselves in the forest. In Western Belorussia, 30 to 50,000 Jews ran away, of whom about 8,000 survived. So these considerations all play a role in your estimation. Also, as a preliminary comment, I remind you, you need time. This is not a simple matter to form resistance groups. First of all, when the ghettos were first formed, nobody knew it was going to lead to Auschwitz. The final solution had not yet been consummated in the minds of Himmler and Hitler. That would only come in the fall of 1941, after the invasion of Russia. 42, after the invasion of Russia, right? December. Now, the fact is that time is important because Jews needed to get a weapon. No Jew had a weapon. In Boca Raton, does any Jew have a weapon? We don't hunt. We don't out and kill people, kill deer, kill rabbits, kill anything else to eat it because it's not kosher. We're not part of the idea of a gun culture. So there was no weaponry. We had no communications network. We had no resistors. All of those things have to happen slowly. And people finally have to wake up to the fact that resistance is a real possibility, but it's very, very dangerous. And then when they realize it's very, very dangerous, they have to cross the Rubicon and say, I'm willing to take the chance. But it's not easy to take the chance. Who of you were brought up, or you brought up your children to be murderers? Who of you brought up your children to be thieves, fraudulent papers, black market activity, secret weapons? None of us. So the whole character of resistance for Jews was very, very difficult. In addition, I would point out to you comparative issues again, that the non-Jewish undergrounds, who usually get the lion's share of praise and heroism, and they're told how wonderful, and they were wonderful, but they came late in the war. They came 43, 44, the Polish underground at the end of the war, the Nazis had been defeated. In Yugoslavia, Tito only in 43 and 44. In El Alamein after 42, right? Some of the European countries woke up. Stalingrad after the victory of winter 43. So the fact is that you mustn't be hard on the Jews if they take time, if they don't have a forest nearby, if they don't have a gun. Also, this may surprise you because I know life in Boca is very placid, but Jews have differences among themselves. And here we see a divided Europe of a very, very significant kind. First of all, remember, there was no common nationality. There were 9 million Jews in Europe, but some were Russians and some Poles, some Frenchmen, Italian, English, French, Dutch. In addition, they had no common class. They weren't all affluent Rothschilds. It was more likely that they were peasants in the shtetl. Educationally, those in the West could speak the local languages, went to school, secular schools, went to university. Those in the East, much less so, still spoke Yiddish, still preferred a yeshiva education. Religiously, they were divided, non-religious altogether, Bundists, Jewish socialists, Reform Jews in Germany, Neo-Orthodox Jews in Germany, Charedim and Misnagdim in Eastern Europe, Agudat Yisrael, Hasidic masters in Poland and Romania. So there was no centralized tie that Jews had, no common link. Also, that meant there was no common leadership and there was no common agenda. When you look at the history of the ghettos, you see something very interesting. Where there was resistance, it comes late and it's very difficult. Why? Because you had division. You had, first of all, revisionists. Right? That means a certain group of Zionists. You had mainstream Zionists. You had nationalists who are Polish oriented, spoke Polish, wanted to be Polish citizens. Then you had all the communists. Then you had the Aguda, the ultra-Orthodox. How are they going to get together? And it was only in the end, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto, that they finally got together. And they accepted the leadership of a 24-year-old Zionist boy named, oh geez, my brain has stopped for a minute. Anyway, I'll come back to that, right? Mordechai Analevitz. So the fact is that this ghetto life, this division, this separation is very, very important. And the Orthodox need a special mention because the Orthodox generally, almost without exception, refused to fight. They saw it as a test from heaven, and therefore they saw this as God's punishment and a test. We were sinful. They rejected Zionism because it violated a certain code that had been set out in the Talmud about Jewish activism in the diaspora. But they had their own sense of resistance. They went Kiddush Hashem, to do honor to God. They went to verify the faith of their fathers. They went like Isaac at the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis. So the fact is that this is a very, very complicated business, being so divided. Also, you need to know that not all Jews were single, not all Jews were young. I mentioned earlier. For example, in many ghettos, Shauli, for example, in Shavli, we have the following case. We have young people form an underground group, and they go to the Jewish council, the Judenräte, and they say to the Judenrat, we want to make an outbreak from the ghetto. We want your help. We're going to break out. We're going to the forest. The head of the Jewish council says to them, and what's going to happen to your mother? What's going to happen to your father? What's going to happen to your grandmother? What's going to happen to your wife and to your children? So they didn't go. But it wasn't because they were cowardly, it was because they were heroic. They put the saving of their mother, their father, their children ahead of everything else. There's a famous discussion of this in Abba Kovna's book, where he talks about how he was the leader of the underground in Vilna, but he asked the famous question after the war, was I a hero or a sinner when I left my mother in a bunker in Vilna? It's a profound question, ladies and gentlemen. Was he a hero or a sinner? Then there's another issue that I call to your attention, I want you to think about. And that's a subject always underestimated when one talks about the Holocaust and about resistance in particular. The subject is reprisals. Reprisals. You all know what a reprisal is. For example, when the city of Lidice murdered one of the leaders of Nazism, Heydrich, Czechoslovakia, Hitler wiped out the entire city of Lidice. Reprisals. The Jews knew that they were always threatened with the reprisals. If they did something, one person might do it, but others might pay for it. So when Jews calculated resistance, they had to think very profoundly about its consequences. Sure, it would be wonderful if they could kill some Nazis, run away, but that might leave those who are behind as sacrifices to the monster. So the responsibility is a very great responsibility. It's not only for you, it's a responsibility for the whole ghetto. I tell you one case. There was one ghetto, a small ghetto, had 3,000 Jews. Name was Dolhinov, Dolhynov. And there was a Jew who broke out of the ghetto and caused some damage to the Nazis. The Nazis caught him and another person. They brought them back to the ghetto and they put them under lock and key. Of course, they had some assistance from within the ghetto, and the ghetto members saw to it that they could get out of the ghetto and run away again because they knew they would be put to death. The head of the SS command in the area came to the head of the Judenrat and said, if you don't return these two Jews to us within 48 hours, 72 hours, we're going to take a reprisal. They couldn't be found in the 72 hours. They couldn't be found in the 72 hours. So what did the Nazis do? They murdered all 3,000 members of the Dolhinov ghetto. 3,000. Right? 2 or 3 people. So it means 1,000 persons were murdered for every one who might have gotten away. Also, I want to emphasize to you something that might seem odd to you. Those of you who've studied the Shoah a little bit, and I imagine in an audience like yours, many people are really expert. You've probably read, for example, The War Against the Jews by Lucy Davidovich, other books of that sort, even some places in Hilberg, the greatest of the Holocaust historians. The idea that the Nazis wanted, that Hitler already had in his mind's eye, already constructed the final solution already in 1924 with Mein Kampf. In other words, it was always there. He was always going to murder the Jews of Europe. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that's not the case. In 1924 in Mein Kampf, the only thing he says about killing Jews is that we had strung up a few profiteers in World War I, we wouldn't have lost the war. In the 1930s, with all kinds of fraud and chicanery and corruption, The Jews of Germany, as I told you, were allowed to go. Adolf Eichmann was sent to Vienna to let the Jews of Vienna leave if it gave up their property. The final solution was only formed after the successful invasion of Russia. After the successful invasion of Russia, which was a rout, Stalin had killed all the senior officers in the Russian army because he was fearful of them. He was a really paranoid character. So he had no generals, he had no Air Force pilots, he had no submarine captains. So 5,000, listen to the number, 5,000 Russian prisoners of war were captured in the first few months of the war, and the German army almost got as far as Leningrad and Moscow, which they began to siege later in the year. Now, it was only at that point, with enthusiasm that was generated by this extraordinary, unbelievable victory, that Himmler and Hitler got together in the fall and talked about it. Now, we know from Himmler's daybook, it's very interesting, when the Russian state fell, Soviet Union fell and opened its archives, scholars found in the archive a very important book, Himmler's day diary. Right? Himmler every day wrote down what he was doing and where he was doing and who he was doing with. So in a couple of entries for the fall of 1941, he tells us that he went to see Hitler. He doesn't tell us what was discussed, but we know that after those meetings, Hitler started to have meetings. For example, he had one with a diplomat from Romania. He had one with a diplomat from Germany, and he started to tell them about the final solution. Now he felt he could exercise the final solution because there was no resistance. No resistance. They'd swept Europe. In the spring of 40, they'd swept Dutch, Belgian, France, all of them gone. England was hanging on by their fingernails.
Hello?
Lend-Lease, and it weren't for the effect of secret dealings between Churchill and Roosevelt, England would have fallen also. And now Russia was gone. The most important were the great battles of World War II. They lost 20 million people, the Russians, the Great Patriotic War. So you need to understand that when Jews are resisting, they don't really know what they're resisting. Or put another way, what they're resistance is not Auschwitz. Now, if what you're resisting is not Auschwitz, if it's not extermination, if it's not the final solution, then maybe you don't have to rise up and resist physically like others had to do or could do. You thought you'd ride it out, just like had always been the case in Jewish history. We have tomorrow night the story of Esther and Haman, right? The story of people under pressure by a mamza who wants to murder the Jewish people. 5th century before the Common Era. Before that, 2 months ago, we celebrated Hanukkah. The Hashmonean rose up, defeated Antiochus IV and the Syrian Greeks. We survived. But now the Jews said, we can survive this too. We'll put our heads down and we'll survive. And we'll have a strategy for survival that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Also, it was very hard. We all live 75 years after the Holocaust. We're saturated with Holocaust information. We know the end of the story. But the people who were living it forward, not living it backwards like we do. And when they were thinking about what might be possible, they simply could not believe it'd be places like factories of death built to produce corpses of 6 million Jews. It's unbelievable. It's unthinkable. Anything like this had ever happened in human history. We know, for example, that in 1943, Jan Koski, as a representative, a very great man I had the privilege of knowing early in my career, came from the Polish underground to Washington. And he had a meeting with Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice, obviously someone sympathetic to Jewish interests. And he told Frankfurter about the death camps. And Frankfurter said to him, as he recorded in his subsequent notes and then published in a book, Frankfurter said to me, I don't deny what you say, but I don't believe it either. As late as 43. Remember, 42 was the great year of the Holocaust. More Jews were killed in 42 than any other year. Himmler gave an order to close all the ghettos. It didn't succeed in 42, went on into the early months of 43. For most, only really Lodz would survive till 44. The fact is that he didn't believe it. When it got to the Fovitz, the Jewish newspaper, the Yiddish newspaper in New York, they didn't know what to do with the news. They said, during World War I, there were a lot of these scares. People were making up lies about the Germans, gas and other things. On the other hand, if we don't publish it, history will never forgive us. So what did they do? They published it on page 8 on an inside page. The news of the Holocaust in the Fovitz was on page 8. So the fact is, this is a hard thing to believe. Moreover, when the Jews looked for assistance, looked for sympathy, looked for weapons, for example, when they approached the Polish underground on the eve of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, they got a few handguns. I think there were 8 guns given to them. The Polish underground was stocked with thousands of weapons that had been supplied by airdrop by the British and Americans, because the Poles were always talking about an uprising in Warsaw, which only came in the last few months of the war. And everywhere you look in Europe, you'll find the same. In the Ukraine, there was uniformly anti-Semitic leadership. In Russia, Stalin, when he made up his 5-year plans, never mentioned the Jews, only mentioned Soviet citizens being attacked by the German invaders. Never took a step. In fact, the reverse. He thought, it seems, that if he could use the Jews to slow down the German advance, especially the work of the Einsatzgruppen and the killer squads who came into Russia with the Wehrmacht, with the Russian German forces, then he would be able to get the rest of the Russians to run away. Jews would be fodder. Jews would be sacrificed. He didn't care about Jews. He was a notorious anti-Semite. Lithuania, Latvia, local groups did most of the killing, other than the Einsatzgruppen, right? The local groups of underground Lithuanians and others now came to power with the invasion of the Wehrmacht, and they befriended the Wehrmacht, and they did the killing wherever they could do it. Commando units of Einsatzgruppen A leave us a very detailed record of the role of the locals. The same in Latvia. So the fact is, everywhere in Europe, there was no help for the Jews. So don't be critical if you don't know that no one was willing to give them a weapon or give them a hand or feed them. Even in Western Europe, which we like to think of as our friends, the fact is, Churchill, who was a very active Zionist, whose early career was actually paid for by Rothschild money, who came into the House of Commons crying when he got news about the final solution. He didn't open the gates of Palestine to Jewish refugees. You all know the story of Jews not being admitted, going secretly. You all know the story. Reed, can you do something here? When you have, I've got it back. You have the story of the British blockades. You all know the story of the Exodus. You all know the story of the Struma in the Black Sea. You know about camps that the British set up for Jews who secretly tried to get into Eretz Israel, Palestine. The British. And the Americans also, as I told you, delay, so that there was no help. Both Britain and America took the view, partly true, partly subterfuge, that they could do best by the Jews by winning the war, and therefore they would not take on any side obligations, any sort of side commitments, any special efforts. So when they were asked to bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz, when the Hungarian Jews were deported, 437,000 Jews in 56 days. They said they couldn't do it. They didn't have the planes. But we know that by accident, they actually dropped bombs in Auschwitz. So the fact is that we had no friends. And therefore, it's very, very important to take all of these things into consideration. Also, I once remember Primo Levi telling me he went to school. You all know Primo Levi, the great survivor, like Elie Wiesel. And he said there was a little boy, when he described what his experience had been at Auschwitz, the little boy got up very courageously, said, "Oh, Mr. Levy, you should have done this, you should have done that. I'll show you how you can get out of the camp," etc. It was very cute. But the fact was, this was not the case. There was nowhere to go, no one to help. And even the undergrounds, for example, in Poland, most of the undergrounds had a rule that if they found Jews, they would murder them. The only Jews they didn't murder were doctors and nurses because they needed doctors and nurses, or if the Jews had guns. Also, the churches provided no support. I don't have time to tell you stories about the Vatican. The Pope was not a moral monster like he's sometimes made out. There was an English historian a few years ago wrote a book called Hitler's Pope. He wasn't exactly Hitler's Pope, but he was not a saint either. He had his own agenda, which was to save the church, to keep the church open so people could go to mass and take the sacraments, which was the essence of Catholicism. So he turned down requests from the Jews and others. The only time he didn't do that was when Zoli, the Jewish rabbi of Rome, secretly came to him one night and said, "The Nazis have threatened us. If we don't give them a large amount of gold, they're going to murder us all." The Pope said, "I'll lend you the money." Jews found their own money, they didn't need it. But there was something peculiar about that, because after the war, we found out that Zoli had been going to mass at St. Peter's for a year already. And after the war, he converted to Catholicism and he lived at the Vatican as sponsored by Pius XII. So this is a very different reality than we usually think of. Also, you have to remember, I've already mentioned the uniqueness. I come back to it again in this sense. The Jews were smart. They were educated, just like we are today. They looked at their situation and they said, what can we do? And they explored Jewish history and general history. And they said, what does history teach us? Remember the famous remark of Santayana, George Santayana, the philosopher, Spanish philosopher who taught at Harvard, who said that if you don't study history, you're bound to repeat it, right? You don't study history, you're bound to repeat it. So the Jews studied history. They'd gone to university, they'd taken history courses, they knew. But what they studied was the wrong thing. They studied Black slavery and they said, you know, we're like the Black slaves in the New World. We're being exploited. We're being utilitarian fodder for the German army, but we're here. They need us. Germans took 12 million people from all the other countries that they occupied to work in the German war industry. They needed more and more and more. They had millions of Jews at their disposal. We didn't need to get paid. We hardly got fed. There was no expense. So we calculated, the leadership of the Jewish people in the ghettos calculated, make themselves useful, they'll be like slaves, they'll survive. Remember, there were about 400,000 to 500,000 slaves imported into the United States before Lincoln's proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. On the eve of the end of the Civil War, there were 5 million blacks in America because people wanted to breed blacks because it was profitable, not kill them. What would be the point of killing them? So the Jewish leadership in the ghettos made the same calculation. They'll keep us alive if we work. But this was a mistake because, as always, the Nazis kept Jews totally in the dark about the reality. That's another deep issue I don't have time to talk about, but I bring to your attention. Now I want to just say to you, because I see time is running out. I think Alan said I have till tomorrow, till they start to read the Megillah. Is that right, Alan? No? tomorrow night. So the fact is that here I just take a few minutes to tell you the ghettos were the step in between. It was also the place where resistance was the most likely because it's the place where there was some autonomy, some control of Jewish life by the Jewish councils, Jewish charities, Jewish elders, Jewish rabbis. But just think of who you're asking to take on this terrible task, this monumental task of resistance. People were eating 300 calories a day on the official amount given to them in the Warsaw Ghetto and elsewhere. 300 calories. According to the World Health Organization, you need 3,000 calories a day if you're a man and you're working to stay healthy, 2,500 if you're a woman. Jews were getting 300. Of course, they were supplementing that with the children who were going out through the walls, but in a meager way, maybe 800, 900. Secondly, everybody in the ghetto was sick. Everybody had dysentery, tuberculosis, all kinds of diseases. Not only was that serious, but they wouldn't go and report it because if they reported it, they were afraid that the SS man who was standing outside the hospital would shoot them as the solution of their tuberculosis. Also, there was cold. Everybody was freezing. They had to give up all their warm winter clothing. Moreover, the conditions as a result of the cold were overwhelming. All the pipes burst, so people couldn't get rid of their waste. There was filth everywhere. So you're asking people who were sick and cold and suffering from anxiety, not knowing if they'll survive another day, to raise up and fight the Wehrmacht. This is why you must be very, very cautious about the Jewish councils. You know they are a source of contention, perhaps the most contentious issue dealing with the Shoah is the Jewish councils. Hannah Arendt, in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, made a terrible slander of the councils. She went so far to call the great Reform rabbi, the head of German Jewry, Leo Beck, the Jewish Führer. Scandalous. But you should know that the councils were very complex organizations, that they came and they went, generally with 3 layers of Judenrat leadership, one after another being killed because they wouldn't do what the Germans wanted. Very, very rarely do we find that they actually collaborated. Moreover, and here's the secret I wanted to tell you earlier about their plan based on black slavery. They thought themselves invulnerable if they would work. So they took to working. So what did they do? All the ghettos that existed long enough to have a policy. Remember, a lot of the ghettos only existed a short time, especially those in the Russian front, which were created in early 42, late 41, and disappeared by 43. They formulated a policy called life for work. Work for life. That is to say, they would work and the Nazis would let them live. And that was what they undertook to do. And for a while, it looked like they would have success. In the Warsaw Ghetto that originally had 450,000, in the summer of 42, they deported half, but there's still half, and the half that was left were the young and the healthy, so the Jewish people would survive. Enlarged, the same by Rumkowski, made a decision to send the children and the elderly. Became the monster of World War II from the Jewish side. The most hated Jew, I think, in World War II was Rumkowski, the head of the Jewish Council. But I remind you that when the ghetto was near deportation, the Russian army was only a few days away, and there were still 70,000 Jews alive in the Lodz ghetto, half of what there had been. Had the Russian army decided to move 3 days faster, Rumkowski would not be the most hated Jew. He would be the most lionized, the most heroic Jew of World War II. Very interesting complication. Also, you have in other places all kinds of heroic acts where the Jewish council supported the underground, and therefore don't ever make the mistake of simply talking about the Jewish councils as traitors to the Jewish people, as betraying the Jewish community. I would add just one line about the Jewish police in the ghettos the same. There were monsters in the Jewish police who used their privilege to save their families, to save themselves. But you should know that it was not always true. The most famous case was in Kovna. In Kovna, there were 150 policemen roughly. The SS learned that there was an underground movement in Kovna, and they came to the head of the council and of the Jewish police, and they said, round them up. The Jewish police refused to do it. All 150 were taken and interrogated. Not one policeman would betray the underground, and they were all murdered. Shouldn't forget that, just as much as you shouldn't forget Rumkowski. So the fact is, all of these issues play a role. Now, I see I've talked too long, but I hope you'll give me 5 more minutes. The fact is that there's one basic thing that I need to convey to you, and that is that resistance is a broad subject. It has to be thought about in broad ways. As I said earlier, usually it's thought about in narrow ways, not unreasonably, military ways, carrying a gun, blowing up a tank, blowing up a train, killing Nazis, shooting down airplanes. But for the Jews, that was not the only objective. In fact, it was not even the main objective. The objective for the Jews was survival, yes, so physical. But there was another assault made against Jews that was not made against anyone else. And that is the aggression, the effort of the Nazis to destroy Jews as human beings. Right in our knowledge of the camps and of the ghettos, we know that the Nazis did everything to shame the Jews, to despoil the Jews, to reduce the Jews. They were called Untermenschen, subhuman, and they were not part of the family of moral obligation. So what did the Jews have to do? They had 2 things to do. They had to fight physically for survival, but they also had to fight for their dignity. They had to show the Nazis, and through the Nazis, the world, that the Jews were not parasites, that they were not rats like you see in the old German Nazi movies, that they were not bacilli undermining human natures. The fact is that the Jewish objective in every ghetto and then in the death camps was spiritual resistance, as I mentioned earlier. Spiritual resistance. That meant you stood up and you said, we're still human. We're still part of the human family. I once had the occasion when I was with Ellie at the 50th anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz. We met the chief rabbi of Warsaw, Poland, who had been in the camp with him. And he said, come, I'll show you where he was. He took us and he said, every morning, 15 minutes early, he would get up and he would trade a little bit of his prior day's ration to somebody who had a pair of tefillin in the camp. Tefillin. Because Jews who put on tefillin are not animals. People who pray to God are not animals. Faith is not for animals. Studying Torah. David Weiss-Livni, the great Talmudist, who now lives in Jerusalem, tells a story about how he was a boy, same town from Szeged as Eli. And what happened? One day he was bringing something to a god, about 14 years old, and the god had with him a wrapped sandwich, and he threw the wrapping away. What was the wrapping? A page of the Talmud. So David asked, at the cost of his life, could he have it? He said yes. For the next 3 years, he studied the Talmud every day, kept him alive, Torah study. Tzaddikim, Rabbanim gave classes. Professors gave lectures. Orchestras gave musical performances, the most famous, of course, in Theresienstadt. Because singing a Yiddish song was resistance. Trying to keep a kosher diet was resistance. We know that in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were thousands of minyanim. You all know a minyan, a prayer quorum of 10 men every day. And they took their life in their hands by doing so. But they wanted to show that they were still men. with order, with culture, with values. So this idea of spiritual resistance, you need to grab onto very tightly and study it. And you have to realize that every ghetto had spiritual resistance, every ghetto. With regard to physical resistance, a different story. You all know the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. But I want to tell you that if you study the ghettos closely, more generally, you don't look at the Warsaw Ghetto, because the Warsaw Ghetto, you all know. But you look at Lodz and Bialystok and Slonim, you'll find the following, that there were hundreds, I want to stress, hundreds of resistance groups in the other ghettos. Remember, there were in the end 1,100 ghettos because of all the ghettos that were created on the Russian front that only survived a little while. But altogether, there was over 100 Jewish ghettos in the Ukraine that had resistance, over 60 in Poland that had resistance. It's a very big issue. Nobody knows the story. It's never mentioned. People only think of Warsaw. Happened everywhere that was a possibility. Also, the fact is that the ghetto showed great heroism. They had soup kitchens. You all should know the story of Janusz Korczak, the great Jewish educator who ran the Warsaw Ghetto orphanage, saved Jewish lives. He was Dr. Seuss of Poland. When the Polish underground came and said, we'll save your life, he said, no, I can't leave my orphans. And he went with them holding their hand, carrying the flag of his orphanage, and they all were immolated. They were all gassed and immolated at Auschwitz. Resistance of an extraordinarily heroic kind. And what about the doctors and nurses in the various Warsaw hospitals and ghettos who worked up the courage to give Jewish children poison to kill them rather than see them go off to Auschwitz? Very complex story about the ghettos and resistance, spiritual and otherwise. So I want to say to you that there's here a whole story, a whole world I've had to rush through, but I hope you've gotten the message that this is a complicated story, not usually the one that's told. Lambs to the slaughter, quoting Psalms. The fact is, Jews didn't go like lambs to the slaughter. Some went passively, but the majority of the Jewish people were heroic. In addition, comparison is again relevant. If you look at the comparison, for example, the 12 million people who were taken by the Germans as forced labor back to Germany, you don't find any uprisings. Of course, they weren't under threat of death, but no resistance. And more importantly, if you look at the 5 to 6 million Russian prisoners of war that were taken captive in the first few months of the war, you'll find no major resistance. Now, this is remarkable, 5 or 6 million Russian prisoners of war. Remarkable because in the first year and a half, 2 million would die from hunger. They knew that Himmler was starving them to death. A year into it, Himmler realized that they were workers, so he stopped starving them and he killed them through work. No resistance. They were men under arms. They had units with captains and lieutenants and sergeants. They had all been trained in military affairs. Their families were far away in Siberia, didn't need to be protected, weren't worried about reprisals, yet no resistance. Now, I don't tell you that to demean them. It's exactly what you would expect. If you weren't fed and you were hungry and you had been overwhelmed by the German army and you had collapsed without much of a fight and you wound yourself up in a prisoner of war camp where conditions were appalling, that you would expect. But the Jews, under even worse conditions, did all the things we've talked about. They did uprising spiritual everywhere. They did uprising in the ghettos. They did uprising in the underground. Almost every country in Europe had a Jewish underground that I didn't have time to talk about. And then, of course, most famously, they had uprisings in the death camp. There was an uprising in Sobibor, and Himmler closed it afterwards. There was an uprising at Treblinka, and Himmler closed it. And the most famous, there was an uprising in Auschwitz, in October 6, 744, never again was a Jew gassed at Auschwitz. They blew up the gas chamber, the crematoria. It saved 70,000 Jewish lives that were still alive when the Jews were put into the forced marches back to Germany in January as the Russians approached. And some considerable percentage of those forced marches lived. And they lived because of the uprising in October 6, 7. So I conclude with a thought, which I try to emphasize, I hope is not Pollyannish. But the question that you really should ask, the interesting question, isn't why was there so little Jewish resistance? That's the usual question. The really interesting and correct question is, how could there have been so much? Thank you.